52% of Republicans still support Donald Trump. Now, that was before the latest indictment.
How can people navigate polling right now?
The whole race changes and those national numbers changes. So that's what to watch. What are the polls saying in those key early states?
With the race for the White House thrown into even greater uncertainty with the indictment of former President Trump, despite these charges, the latest polls show that he remains the strong frontrunner for the GOP nomination. But do those polls really matter when it comes to a vote more than 1 year from now? Doug McKelway has been investigating. Doug.
Lindsay, good to see you. Thanks very much. You know, at the time of Donald Trump's latest indictment on 37 charges related to improper handling of classified documents, the American political landscape is in chaos. The future profoundly uncertain. But the 77-year-old Trump's many legal troubles may be matched by the 80-year-old incumbent President Biden's own frailties, not just creeping infirmity, but the drip of a bribery scandal that grows by the day. The re-election of either man, Gerard Baker writes in the Wall Street Journal, quote, will never end the national standoff. Whoever wins is guaranteed a judgment of illegitimacy. Yet, each man remains atop polls in advance of next year's primaries. The RCP average shows Trump's 44% is double that of closest rival Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, while in the Democratic nomination fight, Biden's 68% outclasses nearest competitor Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s 12%. But history shows that polling at this early stage of a campaign is nothing to bank on.
Well, newsflash, the race is wide open. It hasn't even begun yet. So whether it's Senator Scott or Governor DeSantis, I'm expecting that this is going to be a wide open race. At this point, Shannon, in 2007, if you looked at polls, Rudy Giuliani would have been the nominee. This race hasn't even begun. And from this conservative leader, I can tell you that we're very excited about the bench we have.
Making the 2024 race all the more unpredictable is the slow erosion of support for Biden and Trump within their respective parties. As of April 25th, an NBC poll found Trump still enjoyed a loyal MAGA base, about 52% of Republicans. But among the general population, that number sinks to only 24%. And since the Florida indictment, leading Republicans from Nikki Haley to Tim Scott to Mike Pence, Asa Hutchinson, and former Attorney General William Barr, as well as many others, have openly expressed concern about Trump's reckless behavior as laid out in the indictment. That, while more Democrats are now openly questioning Biden's fitness for a second term. More urgently, Democrats are feeling heat from Monday's new revelation in the Biden bribery scandal. Senator Chuck Grassley revealing on the Senate floor that in a transcribed FBI interview, a trusted informant alleges that a board member of the Ukrainian energy company Burisma may have serious compromise on Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Compromise that confirms the father and son's acceptance each of $5 million bribes from the company while Biden was vice president.
That the foreign national who allegedly bribed Joe and Hunter Biden allegedly has audio recordings of his conversation with them. 17 such recordings.
Has that left another opening for other Democrats to challenge Joe Biden? Coincidentally, that same Monday night as Grassley's floor speech, Fox News' Sean Hannity featured a most unlikely guest for that conservative network, California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom. A septuagenarian against an octogenarian, both facing legal trouble, both having already demonstrated an inability to heal this nation's huge divides. Is that our binary choice in 2024? Well, don't hold your breath. There are new candidates waiting in the wings amidst growing national frustration with inflation, energy costs, wokeism, double standards in the justice system, the threat of war, and world instability. So buckle your seatbelts, hold on tight. The roller coaster ride for the 2024 presidency is just beginning. Lindsay?
Thank you for that reporting, Doug. I want to continue this conversation with you, and I also want to bring in Bob Cusack, who is the editor-in-chief at The Hill. Bob, welcome to this conversation. I'm excited to talk about this because so many people think the odds are already stacked, but as Doug put well, it's not. So how can people navigate polling right now in such a time of uncertainty when we have so many candidates and Trump doing so well?
Well, and thanks for having me on. When you look at the polls, you have to be cognizant of the fact that front runners usually don't do that well. So Trump, as you mentioned, is way up in the Republican polls. He's beating Joe Biden in general election matchups. But we've got a long way to go. There could be some third-party candidates that get in, and if they were ever going to succeed, maybe this would be the presidential cycle where they would, but usually they don't. But you're seeing more Republicans get in. We have RFK Jr. on the Democratic side, though Joe Biden and Donald Trump at this time appear to be the clear favorites to win the nominations, their respective party nominations. But at the same time, you never know what's going to happen, and politics just changes so quickly.
You know, Doug, you pointed out Rudy Giuliani in 2007, but you also think about Trump when he got in the race originally in 2015. He was only polling around 3%. And obviously, we know what happened with that. So can any of these early people who are polling so low, you see some about 1%, can they make up that ground?
That's the million-dollar question, Lindsay, and I don't know. I don't know if anybody has an answer to that. I've heard other people closely following this race who indicate that Donald Trump is pretty much unbeatable in the Republican primaries. The dilemma he faces, I think, and I cited one poll in the piece which we just ran, I think it was from late April, NBC poll that said that 52% of Republicans still support Donald Trump. Now, that was before the latest indictment, but I think the latest indictment is probably just strengthened his numbers, if anything, within the Republican Party. The problem is when you broaden this out to a general election, if he is the nominee, you have to remember, I remember this is something that Britt Hume said some months ago, and it's sort of stuck in my mind, that for all the love and loyalty that Donald Trump engenders among the MAGA crowd, the hardcore followers, his hardcore base, he engenders tremendous amounts of hatred outside that base, especially among independents and Democrats. And independents are where a presidential race is won or lost in those swing states. And that's what both Donald Trump and the Republican Party really need to be looking out for.
You know, Bob, a lot of these national polls, you know, as Doug pointed out, they don't give us a good indicator of what's happening in these important swing states and these early states. So what should viewers be looking at? Should they be looking at these state polls? I mean, some of them don't have good polling yet on some of these lower candidates.
Yeah, Lindsay, I agree with you. I think the national polls are overrated. They're good to get a glimpse of where nationally the races stand. But the race and races on both sides, they can change, and it can change rapidly after a state like Iowa. Remember, Donald Trump did not win Iowa in the 2016 Republican primary. Ted Cruz did. That upended the race. Now, we know that Trump came back and won New Hampshire and won the nomination, but you have to look at Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. There are some other early ones, Nevada, because that's going to change the whole dynamic. If Ron DeSantis wins Iowa, and I really think he's got to win Iowa to win the nomination, the whole race changes and those national numbers changes. So that's what to watch. What are the polls saying in those key early states?
Well, let me ask you this too, Bob. Does he have to win, or can someone get close? Can someone get in with striking distance of winning Iowa or New Hampshire?
Yeah, it's all about expectations. The politics, just like life, is all about expectations. John McCain finished fourth in Iowa, I believe, and then went on to win the nomination. So he was not expected to do well in Iowa because of his stances on various things, including ethanol, but he ended up winning. So you want to do better than anticipated. So when the expectations are high, and that's a problem for Trump right now, is that he's doing very well, but in all likelihood, that lead is going to shrink at some point. And then the media is going to be writing about it and talking about it. And that can change the dynamic of the race. And of course, debates can change the dynamic of the race. So that's another thing to watch.
I do want to talk about the debates in a minute, but I want to ask you this, Doug, because talk about the media. You look at the two frontrunners in this race right now, Biden and Trump. They're constantly in the news. Obviously, we saw wall-to-wall coverage yesterday of the indictment. Obviously, Biden bribery schemes, so much stuff. He's a sitting president. So how much of this polling has to do with name recognition opposed to anything else?
Well, it's a huge factor right now for people like DeSantis, I think, because I think a lot of people outside the state of Florida, outside the media spectrum of New York, L.A., maybe Chicago, Washington, D.C., don't really know much about Ron DeSantis. I think he has a fundamental weakness in that he is not real TV friendly. He doesn't have that warmth that's translated through the television image. A lot of people, he comes off a little bit cold and calculating, perhaps. unfriendly, maybe in its worst interpretation. I think that that's a different perspective than the one that people in Florida have about him, and they've seen the results that he's able to get. Very much the same agenda that Donald Trump has pushed at the national level, but with more effectiveness because he's a legislator at heart. He understands how to get things done, and he's got the party working in his favor in the state of Florida. The big wild card to me here is the media coverage of all this stuff, because you know, Lindsay, coming from the Newsmax world, I know coming from the Fox News world, Bob, I'm curious about your perspective on this as well, is that we're living in two different worlds here. People have chosen their media of choice. They get entirely different perspectives. I was very curious to see what Donald Trump had to say in the aftermath of the indictment yesterday. And so I was flipping channels, and I saw him make that stop at the restaurant, and I wanted to hear. It was the first remark that we had from the leading Republican contender for the 2024 race. I want to hear what he had to say. And then I started flipping channels, and I see that CNN and Jake Tapper flip away from it right away. Jake Tapper was so offended by it, he didn't even want to see it. And then later that evening, when Trump had his official remarks from the Bedminster Golf Club, again, I watched his remarks, much of the same as what we've heard over the past 8 years from him. But the curious thing was, as I flipped channels, it was not on CNN and it was not on MSNBC. So that world, which is at least 50% of the American public, has no idea what's going on from the perspective I see it, from the perspective that Lindsay sees it. What's your take on that, Bob?
Doug, listen, I agree with a lot of your points. I mean, I think number one, you've got to, it's up to networks to show who the candidates are, and that's important. And it's also going back to personality and policy. Most voters are not voting on policy. They want a likable candidate. They want somebody who can win, and that's something that Trump's got to worry about, having lost in 2020, and then really not doing well in the midterm elections with the candidates that he selected. So that is one to watch. But I do think that it would be wise for these candidates to reach out to all types of media, not be scared of the media. That is very important. We're seeing Vivek Ramaswamy, who is doing a lot of media, and I ran into him in a green room and said, that's the way to go. You've got to get free media. DeSantis is not doing that, and I think he would be wise to do a lot of interviews now that his presidential campaign has been launched.
You have to be out there in the public eye. I do want to ask you this, Bob, before you go, 30 seconds, because you brought up the debates. If Trump doesn't debate, does that hurt him, or does it hurt the other candidates more?
I think if he skips one debate, it probably won't hurt him because he'll do some other type of event. We've seen that in the past. If he decides to skip all the debates or most of the debates, I think that could hurt him because then it looks like, and he can be portrayed and would be portrayed by people like Chris Christie and others as a little chicken. So he's got to show up at these debates. He's a very good debater. We saw that in 2016. He had a shaky 2020 debate against Biden, but he knows how to play to the crowd, and I think it would be smart for Trump to participate in the debates.
There's going to be a lot to talk about, no doubt about that. Doug, Bob, great conversation. Thanks for both being here.